without fail, when we talk about the adrenal gland, everybody forgets where it's located. We're talking about a lot of hormones and glands that exist from the head to the neck, and everyone forgets that the adrenal gland actually sits right on top of the kidneys. It has two primary structures. It has the internal portion, which is the adrenal medulla, and it has the exterior portion, which is the adrenal cortex. And their functions are actually really different, and you can take a look on this slide at the table here that talks about the differences. Some of the primary functions of those differences. The adrenal cortex produces aldosterone and cortisol, and it is involved in chronic responses to some sort of stimuli. So we're not going to see very quick responses from the release of these hormones. They are essential for survival. That is true. Now with the adrenal medulla, it's kind of the opposite. It's responsible for producing epinephrine and norepinephrine, and these are going to be responsible for really acute responses within our body to various stimuli. They're also vital for survival, so that's the common thread between all of the hormones that are produced from this one gland. But you'll want to differentiate, are you in the adrenal medulla or are you in the adrenal cortex? The adrenal medulla, again the inner portion of our adrenal gland, is important for acute responses to exercise, and specifically it's responding to the stimulus of stress. It's part of that fight or flight response that we have anytime we have some sort of stressful event, whether that could be an exam sitting in front of you or being chased by a bear in the woods. Now both epinephrine and norepinephrine can be released, and they're often abbreviated just E or NE. And they're fast-acting hormones. They're going to bind to adrenergic receptors that exist on different cells, and there are alpha receptors as well as beta receptors. And we'll look on the next slide, but specific to epinephrine and norepinephrine, they tend to bind to specific types of receptors, which will dictate the type of responses that they have. Generally, epinephrine will be responsible for stimulating the breakdown of glycogen in the liver and muscle, as well as lipolysis in adipose tissue and muscle. So trying to liberate some substrates that we can utilize to produce ATP, which makes sense. We're in a stressful situation. We need to be able to create ATP as part of that fight or flight response. It also increases skeletal muscle blood flow, increases heart rate and the contractility of the heart, while also increasing oxygen consumption. Norepinephrine is responsible for stimulating lipolysis in the adipose tissue and to a lesser extent within the muscle. It's also going to work to constrict the arterioles and the venules so that you can maintain blood pressure as you are fighting or fleeing in this response. Some fun facts about epinephrine and norepinephrine is they're collectively referred to as catecholamines. And because the origin of epinephrine is in the adrenal gland, sometimes you also hear it referred to as adrenaline. Approximately 80% of the secretion of the adrenal medulla is going to be secreting epinephrine, while just 20% is norepinephrine, though this percentage roughly varies depending on the different physiological situation. Generally, the pattern that we see is norepinephrine concentrations increase significantly at intensities above 50% of someone's VO2 max. But epinephrine concentrations won't increase until later, so they won't start to pronouncedly increase until about 60 to 70% of someone's VO2 max. Now, I really like this summary table between epinephrine and norepinephrine. And it specifically is talking about the different receptors that exist, our alpha and beta receptors for these two hormones. Remember, if the receptor is not there, they'd have no action on the tissue. But importantly, it talks about the preference for those receptors, either for epinephrine or norepinephrine. Now you'll notice in just about every circumstance, our epinephrine is going to be preferred over norepinephrine. The exception is our beta-3 receptors, and the importance of their function is lipolysis, so increasing the breakdown of fat. In every other scenario, the things that are increasing our heart rate, having bronchodilation, overall dilation within our vessels, as well as affecting metabolism, all of those other receptors tend to have a higher preference for epinephrine in this case. Now, we've already talked about cortisol, our stress hormone that's released from the adrenal cortex, but we haven't yet talked about aldosterone. And aldosterone is another hormone that's really important for controlling our overall plasma volume. Unlike antidiuretic hormone that stimulates the reuptake of water, aldosterone stimulates the reuptake of sodium and potassium. And importantly, if you've learned in cell biology, wherever sodium goes, water is going to follow. So in turn, what will happen if you have reuptake of sodium and potassium is you'll have reuptake of water or water maintenance as well. The things that will trigger aldosterone release are low plasma volume or a high amount of potassium within the body. On the next slide, we're going to talk about how aldosterone is part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Anytime we're having maintenance or changes with our blood or water volume, plasma volume in this case, we're going to be affecting blood pressure. So not only does the stimulation of the release of aldosterone go up when we do long, high intensity physical activity because we're sweating and we're having to regulate our plasma volume, but in some individuals, we can use this cascade to treat them for high blood pressure. And we'll talk about how we do that. So let's walk through a review of what's going to happen with the renin-angiotensin system, or the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system as it's often referred to. Let's say, for example, there's a drop in blood pressure, or more commonly, a drop in fluid volume that would happen if someone were doing exercise and they would become dehydrated. Well, the next step here is that dehydration can then cause a decrease in blood pressure, which is going to be sensed by the kidneys. This will cause the release of renin to be secreted by the kidneys. That renin will convert the protein angiotensinogen that is released by the liver to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, in the lungs will convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is able to act directly on the blood vessels, which will cause vasoconstriction, increasing blood pressure. Additionally, angiotensin 2 will act on the adrenal cortex, so the outer portion of the adrenal gland, to cause the release of aldosterone. Aldosterone can then act on the kidneys, and specifically in the kidneys, it's going to cause the reabsorption of sodium. And it also says water here. Technically, it's causing the reabsorption of sodium, but water is always going to follow sodium if it's being reabsorbed. So that's just a principle from chemistry. It's this function that's going to increase overall plasma volume, also leading to an increase in blood pressure. Now, many of you may know someone who takes lisinopril, which is a commonly prescribed ACE inhibitor. And in this case, it's working to treat high blood pressure in individuals who have hypertension. It can also be used to treat congestive heart failure as well. So in a normal individual, the ACE enzyme, which is released from the lungs, will convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2 as part of the cascade to increase pressure. In individuals who have chronic hypertension, instead, someone is given lisinopril, which inhibits the formation of ACE, which will then not allow angiotensin 1 to be converted to angiotensin 2. So it's going to prevent the vasoconstriction that would occur. So in this case, it's maintaining dilation, which would lower blood pressure overall. Now you'll notice during exercise that we get an increase in renin, aldosterone, and angiotensin. But importantly, we don't see a really substantial increase until we're at those higher intensities of exercise, so over 50% of someone's VO2 max. And that would make sense because you'd want to be at an intensity that was high enough that you'd actually be having disturbances in your plasma volume and needing to regulate your blood pressure. There are two different hormones that are released from adipose tissue themselves. So your adipose tissue or your fat tissue would be considered an endocrine gland. Leptin and adiponectin. Leptin influences appetite by signaling to the hypothalamus whenever you are full. And it also enhances insulin sensitivity and fatty acid oxidation at the level of the pancreas. Adiponectin increases insulin sensitivity as well as fatty acid oxidation. The level of these hormones is dependent on the amount of adipose tissue within the body, and that's going to change over time. So these hormones are more involved in long-term regulation of food intake, not the immediate sensation that you are full or that you are hungry in these cases. Leptin specifically is also an indicator of energy balance, and its circulating concentrations are proportional to someone's body fat. So here's where it's a little tricky. In obese humans, circulating concentrations of leptin are elevated, which you would expect. But many obese humans are actually leptin resistant, which means their brain in these cases are not receiving those signals to suggest that we can decrease hunger. Truly, researchers are only beginning to understand how the hormonal appetite signaling changes with weight gain and obesity actually affect our long-term body weight status. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about our glucose metabolism and the hormones that affect glucose metabolism. We have two hormones that actually work opposite of each other. We have insulin, which is going to work against hyperglycemia, and we have glucagon, which is going to work against hypoglycemia. So the function of insulin is to do its job when we have a high amount of glucose within the blood. This is going to occur right after we've had a meal and we've broken that substrate down to a bunch of glucose molecules that now we need to do something with them so we don't remain hyperglycemic, which has a lot of negative physiological effects within the body. So insulin will bind to its receptors on the cell, which will facilitate the uptake of glucose into the cell. Now we're going to top off our glycogen stores with that glucose, and any extra leftover glucose that we have, we're actually going to convert to fat and store within the tissue as well. Whereas glucagon has an opposite job. Its job is to increase blood glucose whenever we are hypoglycemic, meaning low blood glucose. This is important because our brain uses glucose as a fuel. And so in this case, its job is to then take our storage glucose and make that available to blood glucose. So the function of glucagon is to increase glycogenolysis, so breaking down our stored glycogen, as well as gluconeogenesis. A lot of this is taking place in the liver, which is where we're usually having our maintenance of blood glucose occurring. So the target tissue here would be the liver. Where are each of these produced within the pancreas? Well, our insulin is produced in the beta cells, and our glucagon is produced in the alpha cells. And if you've ever heard of someone having diabetes, specifically type 1 diabetes, their beta cells do not produce insulin in the way that they should in order to maintain or have maintenance of overall blood glucose. Someone with very severe type 2 diabetes eventually may lose function of those beta cells within their pancreas, and then they will look like someone who's also type 1 diabetic as far as what the physiology of the disease looks like. However, it doesn't start that way. Now, I'll say this once, and then I'll probably say it 100 times, but exercise is a great medicine, and insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes is a great example of this. So we expect insulin resistance as a character of type 2 diabetes, and it plays a big role in how this disease develops. Now, typically what we expect to see is beta cell failure in these individuals at the level of the pancreas. But actually, skeletal muscle insulin resistance is considered to be the initiating or primary defect that can be evident decades before anyone ever has beta cell failure, and then that overt hyperglycemia that would develop as a consequence if you weren't able to signal to increase or bring in the glucose from the blood into the muscle. Now, in a healthy cell, what you would expect to happen is that insulin would bind to an insulin receptor, and then there are these downstream pathways that are going to occur utilizing second messengers that eventually are going to activate the central kinase AKT. And this would stimulate GLUT4 transporters to go to the surface of the cell to be able to pull the glucose from the blood into the muscle. However, we know with type 2 diabetics that this process is not occurring correctly because they've become desensitized to that insulin that's being produced from their pancreas. So instead, what you can do is you can have that person exercise. And what it does is it just uses an alternative pathway to have those GLUT4 transporters move to the surface of the cell. So in this case, by doing that exercise, it activates the kinase AMPK. And this AMPK kinase can also cause those GLUT4 transporters to go to the surface of the cell, which will then transport the glucose from the blood into the muscle and controlling overall blood glucose, thereby controlling that person's diabetic status. So it works just as well. And if you take something like metformin or any of the other type 2 diabetic drugs, they're working in this fashion as well. But you can also just get that same response by having someone go for a walk after they eat their meal. It works really, really well.